Welcome back to Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner Campbell. In today's episode, I am because of them. My success was not forged from the diversity, equity, inclusion business case. I'm going to focus on some of my work experiences and talk about the shift away from diversity, equity, inclusion that's happening in many parts of the work world and work environments, whether it's in the States or in Canada or globally. And I'm also going to focus a bit on what happens next. Where do we go next? Particularly those of us who are in communities that are disproportionately impacted by hiring practices that are not inclusive, fair, or equitable. And so I will start with my journey. So many years ago, when I was starting in the work world in, I'd say, late 90s, early 2000s, I had worked prior to that as a teenager and a young child. But in terms of my adult life and getting into the work world, there were no diversity, equity, inclusion policies and practices. Many of those initiatives actually didn't start into the mid 2000s. And when those initiatives got started in the early 2000s, it really was particularly focused on the corporate world, so for-profit businesses. The other side, where not-for-profits were certainly using more anti-oppression, anti-racism, equity. There may have been a push to be more inclusive in terms of hiring practices, thinking about disability rights, disability awareness, accessibility, and many of those movements to make workplaces more inclusive were grassroots movements and less about the business case and more about ensuring that people's human rights were being upheld and followed. Looking at, if you're in Ontario, thinking about the Ontario Human Rights Code and looking at what kind of provisions folks needed in order to be safe and feel that they could bring their whole selves to work. And so with the push for DEI being a business case, we are now coming full circle where many of the businesses that have invested perhaps millions of dollars in marketing, in building connections with communities, with their outreach in terms of human resources, talent, people, and culture, have decided that for a number of different reasons, it might be financial, it might be for fear of punitive action by some political individuals or organizations or governmental organizations, they are now making a hard shift to get rid of those policies or those initiatives. I'd like to just bring us back to the purpose of DEI or inclusion. It is really about ensuring that individuals and the communities that they come from, particularly historically marginalized communities, are able to participate in a work world that ensures that their health, safety, well-being is taken into account, and that there is a level of equity and fairness and transparency in the process of hiring. Not only that, but also retention throughout their whole employment journey and into retirement. When we don't talk about these issues and we don't talk about them in a way that encompasses the full person or the full issues that are behind it, we see a lot of media sound bites that simply say it's not good business anymore, so they're not doing it. And I would say that it's not necessarily about dollars and cents, but for me, in my line of work, it is about the people, the individuals, and how do we ensure that those folks who are from historically marginalized communities are not being cast aside and are the fodder of some of the sort of politicized and polarized conversations and viewpoints. Mentioning before that in terms of my own journey and my work success and my career successes over the last 30 plus years, most of that, if not, I'd say 90% of my career, there was no DEI. And so for me, it was about being agile. It was about looking at moving forward with titanium grit and determination. It was about drawing on the experiences and the examples and the mentorship of so many who had come before me who managed to carve out spaces for themselves, many as self-employed individuals who may not have been able to break through any glass ceilings in their chosen fields or industries, but found a way through by looking at where they could best lend their expertise and move forward. And so I think there's, something to be said about who has benefited from diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to really understand that the targeting of Black, African, Caribbean communities, Indigenous communities, people living with disabilities, members of the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, gender non-binary, and specifically trans folks, is that you end up in a situation where the mainstream society is getting caught up in, well, we just want to have people hired based on merit and not on favoritism, or their assumption that DEI is about favoritism. And I would gently remind them and ask them to actually, reflect on what that means. I think meritocracy exists whether you have DEI or not. It certainly is an interesting time to be in this work, whether you are studying it as an academic, you are in the work world as an employee or an employer or an entrepreneur, watching these things unfold in real time. And certainly for me, when I look back at my own career, many decades ago, we didn't have the internet and the same kind of access to information. You'd have people who would start businesses, as an example. They would just simply put something in a newspaper, go to media events, they would go to community-based events, a lot of community engagement and mobilization, and talk about the things that they needed to do in order to take care of themselves and their families. And now we're in a situation where you have extraordinarily powerful organizations and businesses trying to determine the trajectory of millions of people's lives by saying that we're not going to look at issues of representation. And for those of us who work in a number of fields where it's about getting people to a place where they understand that they have value and they are contributing to society and that they are valued in society, it's so important to note that one corporation or a corporate entity or a chairperson, what have you, is not going to determine my humanity or other people's humanity, and that we must figure out as community members, how do we move forward to ensure that there is equitable hiring, to ensure that there is fairness in the systems that were not built for many individuals. They did not have historically marginalized folks in mind when they were created, and that we need to move away from the business case argument because it has failed. We now have to be in a position of looking at where do we go from here, removing the emphasis on business case and more on the emphasis of ensuring compliance with human rights, ensuring that businesses and clients and consumers are moving forward with an analysis of representation matters, and that it is an essential component to have a number of different viewpoints and diverse perspectives in those spaces in order to provide the best services, culturally responsive services to the individuals. And it is not about simply determining, well, this no longer has a monetary value, so therefore I'm not going to do it, or this organization is not going to do it. And I think we're certainly seeing people moving toward making sure that their voices are being heard, whether it is through their wallet and not shopping at particular organizations or supporting them. Also looking at what are the alternatives, where do they invest in terms of corporations or businesses who are willing and able to ensure that they are following through on creating spaces of welcoming and belonging and recognizing the importance to community engagement, community development, and really investing in places that their businesses are located, and in the individuals and the groups that take their hard-earned money and invest it back into those businesses. And so I think that, as I come to the conclusion of today's episode, I really want to encourage you to think about three things, sort of a self-reflective practice, and using these guiding questions as a prompt. One, if you were directly impacted as a person from a historically marginalized group in terms of the pullback or the removal of diversity, equity, inclusion, my question to you would be, what would you want to see happen moving forward, given that we are literally in 2025 and things have really appeared to be more regressive in many ways, as we can see the polarization in workplaces, we can see that in service delivery, and the fact that these retreats from DEI or equity or anti-racism, anti-oppression are going to create and sadly leave a space where people are not only fighting for their rights, but fighting for their basic right and getting services that are safe for them and their family members to use. So, we can't underestimate that it is simply not removing a policy or a practice or a protocol. It is about the costs to real individuals in our communities and how we develop collectively. The second question I would ask you is to think about, from your perspective and where you are from your spheres of influence, what do you think are the next logical, reasonable movements forward for us to take action to ensure that the health, safety, wellness, security, fairness, equity are happening in our communities, in our businesses, in our schools, and throughout society? This last question is deeply personal, and it really is about asking you to reflect, regardless of where you are on your journey, in terms of your age, in terms of how you identify, what kind of society and community do you want to be a part of? What do you need in order to not just survive, but to thrive? And why is it important in this, I guess an add-on question would be, why is it important in this day and age that we think about not only our resilience, our need for rest, but also where do we carve out the joy? Particularly, I would say this question is deeply about individuals who are from communities that are being targeted by these regressive policies, by the removal of DEI and other initiatives. And if they're feeling unsafe, how do you carve out safety for yourself, that you know that fundamentally that you are enough and that you are creating and engaging with society from a place of knowing, and that there is joy and growth and optimism, and you can create the opportunities that even when they don't exist. So I would leave you with that sort of 3 or 4 guiding questions that are really about creating your self-reflective practice, but also seeing yourself in a place and spaces where you might feel like you're being excluded. Until next time, thank you for listening. If you're interested in being a guest or getting involved, or if you have some topics that you'd like me to cover on an episode, please let me know. You can find the particulars in the description of the podcast. And if you're listening, please share with others. Thank you for listening to Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner Campbell. Until next time.